Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. A project charter is a great way to summarize the key elements of what you accomplished in the define phase of DMAIC. Remember, the define phase is when we try to understand the problem that we're trying to solve, so the project charter should clearly communicate that. Now, in this lesson, we'll review what a project charter is, and we'll go over a few examples. The three prerequisites for this lesson address the three critical elements of a project charter, which are the problem statement, the project scope, and the project team. Please be sure to check out those lessons if you haven't already done so. But right now, let's begin by defining what a project charter is.
Well, a project charter is usually going to be a one-page document that summarizes all the answers for the questions you're trying to answer within the define phase. Now, the purpose of the project charter is that you want to validate the need for the project and the team who's going to be leading that project. You also want to use the project charter to help acquire and sustain the sponsorship, that is, the sponsor's approval for the project. Now, what are the elements that you might see included within a project charter and the things that should not be included in the project charter? Well, here's several of them that we'll review here. The question you might want to ask is, what is the background context for the business area? Well, it's typically going to be the background statement that helps answer that. If there is a background statement that's required for giving context to the business area of why you're doing this, then that might be necessary to include in the charter. If it's not necessary to add any additional context, then obviously you're not going to need this particular statement or nor include it in the charter itself. What are the symptoms, that is the pain points that are being felt in the business area? Well, that's going to be the problem statement that helps define that. That absolutely has to be included as part of the charter, no question whatsoever. What's included or excluded as part of the project? Well, that's going to be the project scope that helps to answer that. That as well should absolutely be included as part of the charter. What are the potential benefits for the project? Well, the pre-assessment of savings are what might help answer that. And if you have that information, you've done that pre-assessment, it might be helpful to include that in the charter, especially again if you're trying to acquire the sponsorship you need for getting that project done. How does the problem align to the business? Well, it's the CTQ drill down that's going to help answer that. And if that's necessary again to get the project support and sponsorship that you need, then that might be necessary to include. Otherwise, if it's already given and understood of how this project aligns to what's important to the business and you've already got the sponsorship you need, then you may not need to have the CTQ drill down to be included within the charter. Who are the folks that are on the team? This is the list of the core team members, similar to like a stakeholder analysis, but not necessarily as detailed as like an Army tool that might be used. This is good to identify at least some of the core team members. You may not identify everyone. It may not be the full Army tool or RACI document that's used. However, it could be helpful to at least identify the critical team members, especially like the sponsor, champion, and the process owner, and as well as the project leader, like if it's a black belt, a green belt, or whoever it is that might be leading the project. Some of the other folks on the team, then it's up to you in the space that's given on the charter to identify them. What's the plan for attacking the problem? Well, it's the project strategy that's going to help answer that. That, if you think it's necessary as part of the charter, it could be included, but it may not always be included. And what's the process for the targeted area? That's the SIPOC, or maybe the process map that's used to identify some of those process steps. This is not something you would include within the charter. It's something that you might add as part of the project storyboard, or you might include it in the appendix of like a project storyboard, but it's typically not something you would include in the charter itself. And finally, what are the key terms used in the business? What's the operational definitions that might help answer that? And this is not something, again, you would include within the charter. If you have a project storyboard, then those are the things you might include as an appendix or might just keep it offhand as necessary, but you would not embed that within the charter itself. Now, some organizations may require additional elements for the charter, for example, identifying what the project why is, who the finance leader is, pre-assessment details, or different terms like the defects per unit or DPMO, which is defects per million opportunities, or some other key terms having those things defined. And that's okay if an organization requires it, then make sure that you include those elements as part of your charter if your organization requires that information. But if your organization does not require that, doesn't have any standards or a certain template defining the terms necessary for a charter, then typically you may not need to include those things. But you would at least need to include the things we've talked about before that are required. For the most part, you want to keep your project charter simple and clear so that your audience understands why this entire project is important and why it's necessary.
Now let's look at a few examples of project charters.
I'll show you now a few examples of some project charters. The specific elements that are identified in each charter isn't really necessary to get into the details of the background behind the project, but it is helpful to at least see some of these examples of the certain elements that are included as part of these charters. So for example, in this particular project here, this first one, we've identified what we're calling the background statement, giving some context. For this particular project, CAM was the area, the acronym for the area where we were serving the project, and it was necessary to give some background explaining what that means because never everyone is familiar with that. Then we got into the problem statement. This again is an essential element of the project charter, so we had to include the problem statement to define the pain point and the severity of what it is we're trying to address in the project. The project scope, again, that's a very necessary element as part of the project, so we clearly identified the things that are included and what's excluded as part of the project itself. Then we also identified on the charter the elements of the key project team members, those who are the key members that we wanted to include as part of the project and the different roles that they had. Now that is one particular project charter. Now another example of one is this one didn't require a background statement. We just had a real simple problem statement that was identified, one sentence. Then we got into the project objective that was added. This isn't something we identified before as part of the elements that you would include in a project charter, but for this particular one, it was an objective that was set by the executive over this. So because of that, it was necessary to at least restate what that objective is so everyone clearly understands the expectations here. Also, we included the scope, again, which is absolutely necessary for every part of the project, and here we also identified the core team members that were part of this project. Last example I'll show here, and this one, again, we have another background statement because not everyone was familiar with the context for the situation of what we're trying to address, so it was necessary to at least explain in context what this element was, what this acronym, key acronym is for this area where we're targeting the project. But then we had to identify the problem statement, again, that essential element as part of the project charter. So we identified what that was, and then we wanted to include at least the strategy as well. In this case, for the strategy, this really wasn't like a full-fledged project per se, where we necessarily had to have the full team identified, nor the scope in the same way, because the scope was generally understood by the audience, so we didn't find it necessary to include that in here. But it was necessary to explain the strategy and how we were going to attack this particular problem to see if it evolves to a much bigger project beyond the initial analysis that was required. We also identified some key assumptions or risks that we found in using this particular strategy for the project. So because that we thought that was necessary, we wanted to include this up front so the audience is aware of the strategy as well as some of the assumptions we're taking as we roll out and communicate the rest of the analysis through the rest of the storyboard.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, I'd like you to identify at least 2 prior projects where you've worked or certain issues that you might have worked on within your organization. And for each of those, I'd like you to at least try to build a project charter. And be sure to include at least the most critical elements that we've talked about, such as the problem statement, the scope, and identifying the core team members. Make sure those elements are at least included within your project charter. But also consider using some of the other elements you think might have been necessary to outline the charter in terms of, again, trying to get agreement and understanding by the audience who are going to be reviewing the charter. So that could include the background statement, or some description of the financial savings or benefits you might expect from the project, or maybe the strategy or how the project aligns to the CTQs, that's the critical to quality elements that are part of the CTQ drill down. Consider some of these several elements out there to see if those would have helped in outlining the actual project charter. And also review your project charter and eliminate anything that's unnecessary or irrelevant in content on the charter itself. For example, if you or your team had a charter like this before the project, then consider how it would have affected the outcome of that particular project. For example, if you didn't have a charter like this, but you did have one and you created something like this for that project, do you think you could have gotten some faster execution from folks in performing the results of the project and implementing the solutions? Or do you think you could have gotten faster buy-in from the team or faster sponsorship? Could it have helped improve the communication within your team or to other groups that are affected by the project? Those are the kind of the benefits you might expect from a project charter. And if you had a charter like this for the project itself or whatever initiative you're using this as an example for, could it have made a difference in helping it in the long run?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.